Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to really get under the hood of your source material, finding the crucial knowledge and maybe some surprising insights along the way.
That's right.
Today, we are jumping headfirst into something that honestly still feels a bit like science fiction, but is very much a real uh, high-stakes technological race. We're talking about autonomous vehicles.
Self-driving cars, yeah.
You've given us a really interesting set of sources to explore here. One of them is actually titled Steering Through the Technological Storm, a Christian Perspective on the Autonomous Driving Race.
hmm
And it kicks off with a quote I thought was quite powerful from Philippians 4:8. It says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things."
It's a thoughtful starting point for looking at complex technology.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack all the information in these sources you've provided and really pull out the most important nuggets about this whole autonomous driving race.
And it's quite a story. The sources lay out this picture of, rapid change, fierce competition, and some really distinctive personalities involved. Looking at the history is definitely key.
Okay, so let's start there. Where do the sources say this all really kicked off? It doesn't sound like it was just, Google deciding one day to build a robot car.
No, not at all. The sources actually push the origins back quite a bit further. They point to the military's interest, really starting back in the 1990s.
The military, why?
Well, the core motivation seems pretty clear. Keeping soldiers out of harm's way. Getting them out of dangerous situations using unmanned vehicles. Senator John Warner is mentioned as being pretty instrumental in pushing this forward.
And this wasn't just like theoretical discussion.
No, there was actual legislation involved. Section 220 of a 2001 defense bill. It set some really specific, pretty ambitious goals.
Like what?
Things like aiming for a third of combat aircraft and ground vehicles to be unmanned by certain target dates. That kind of legislative push, it provides real momentum and funding, of course.
Okay, that makes sense. A strong driver. So what kind of research was actually happening back then, even before that bill?
Well, the sources mention research is already underway. Places like Carnegie Mellon, with their Navlab series, they were doing work for years.
Right, CMU is a name that comes up a lot.
Definitely. And also, Japan's Akubu Mechanical Engineering Lab was doing some early pioneering stuff. Oh, and one specific event that sources highlight is the 1995 No Hands Across America trip.
95, no hands. That sounds ambitious for the mid-90s.
It really does. It was a Pontiac Transport van, apparently.
Yeah.
CMU researchers drove something like 4,500 kilometers. The system, called RALPH, handled the steering using camera input.
Wow, how long did that take?
9 days. And the sources add this little detail. They apparently listened to a Star Trek audiobook for the whole trip.
Huh, that's actually perfect. A bit of sci-fi inspiration for the real-world tech.
Exactly. A nice touch. But the sources really point to one thing that kicked the modern race into high gear.
It was.
DARPA getting involved. The DARPA Grand Challenges.
Ah, okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah, they were critical. There were three main ones: 2004, 2005, and then 2007. The DARPA director at the time, Tony Kether, he had this idea: use incentive prizes.
Like historical prizes.
Exactly, inspired by things like the old longitude prizes.
Yeah.
The goal was just to spur innovation, get people really competing. The sources even mentioned Tether thought DARPA managers should have the heart of sci-fi writers. Apparently, he was a big fan of Robert Heinlein's "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress."
Interesting. So that first challenge, 2004 in the Mojave Desert, the sources make it sound like, well, a bit of a disaster.
Chaos is probably a better word. Yeah. The failure rate was just incredibly high. Vehicles were getting stuck, crashing. One source compared it to Mad Max.
Really? Mad Max.
Yeah. They give examples like the Cytonics I just vanished, of course. The Samar got tangled up in barbed wire. And this huge military truck, the Terramax, it kept getting stuck because it thought small bushes were, like, major obstacles.
So it was too cautious.
Way too cautious. The sources say DARPA staff eventually just towed it away because Tether got tired of watching it just rock back and forth trying to decide what to do.
Yeah.
It was a really stark example of something called Moravec's paradox.
Moravec's paradox. What's that?
It's this observation that tasks humans find really easy, seeing things, moving around in a complicated, unpredictable world. Those are incredibly hard for robots.
Harder than complex stuff.
Yeah, much harder, it turns out, than things we find difficult, like, say, playing chess at a grandmaster level. Robots can do that, but navigating a cluttered room is tough.
Huh. That really does flip your intuition. But even with all that chaos in 2004, some key teams started to emerge, right? The sources must highlight some of them.
Oh, absolutely. Carnegie Mellon's Red Team. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Led by Red Whitaker and Chris Urmson. They were very engineering-focused, very pragmatic.
They were the ones with the Hummers.
That's right.
Huh?
They actually had two heavily modified Humvees, Sandstorm and H1 Gelage. Basically, one was a backup for the other. Sandstorm was loaded with sensors, LiDAR, cameras.
LiDAR being the laser scanning thing.
Exactly. And they had this custom gimbal to keep the sensors stable and pointing the right way. They even designed an eye-washing system.
Eye-washing?
Yeah, like little windshield wipers and fluted sprayers, but for the sensors to keep the desert dust off them. Really practical stuff.
Sounds like they were well prepared. Did they get advice from anyone interesting?
They did. The sources mentioned race car team owner Chip Ganassi. He gave them some crucial advice.
Which was?
To finish first, you must first finish. Simple, but profound for this kind of challenge. Reliability was everything.
So they seemed like the favorites for 2004.
They definitely looked like strong contenders. But the sources reveal, actually years later, what really cost them the win in that first race.
Oh, what happened?
It was something seemingly small. A mechanical issue with a fuel filter module.
A fuel filter?
Yeah. It basically starved their vehicle, Sandstorm, of consistent power. And that messed with the sensors in the computers. They didn't even figure out the exact cause until much later. The sources describe it as a pretty heavy burden for Whitaker and Urmson at the time.
Wow. All that work. Derailed by a tiny part. So, okay, 2004 was rough. Who actually won in 2005 then?
That was the Stanford team, led by Sebastian Thrun. Their vehicle was named Stanley.
Stanley. What kind of vehicle was it?
It was a Volkswagen Touareg SUV. And their approach, interestingly, was a bit simpler than CMU's in some ways. Like, they didn't use a big complex gimbal for the sensors.
And 2005 went better overall.
Much better. The success rate was way higher. More teams actually finished the course. It became more of a public spectacle, too. People like Steve Wozniak, Larry Page from Google, they were there watching.
So the vibe was different.
Yeah, the sources describe the preparation as much calmer, less frantic than 2004. Stanley, the Stanford vehicle, took first place. And Sandstorm, the CMU Humvee, actually finished second, only minutes behind. It was close.
And DARPA was tracking all this.
Oh, yeah. The sources mentioned this setup that sounded like NASA mission control, tracking all the vehicles across the desert.
Now, the sources also bring up another really unique figure around this time, Anthony Lewandowski.
Ah, yes. He definitely stands out in the narrative. He didn't have that traditional academic robotics background, studied industrial management at Berkeley, apparently built robots from, well, junk parts.
And he had a different kind of attitude.
Seems like it. Known for wanting speed, wanting attention. There's that famous quote attributed to him, safety second. Maybe not meant literally in all contexts, but it definitely suggested a very aggressive, push-the-limits mindset.
And his entry was unusual, too.
Very. For the 2004 challenge, his entry, called Orphan Preferred, was an unmanned motorcycle.
A motorcycle? Seriously? That sounds incredibly difficult.
Right. And his story gets more complicated later on, according to the sources.
How so?
Well, there were accusations later, related to his time at Google, about self-dealing, running his own side company, and then more controversy when he left Google for Uber, allegedly taking proprietary tech with him.
Okay, so a controversial figure.
Definitely. The sources also paint a picture of a pretty distinct worldview, mentioning things like a belief that God is a robot or that machines will eventually rule humanity. It just highlights the really diverse mix of people and philosophies drawn into this race.
Okay, so after the desert challenges in '04 and '05, the focus shifted pretty dramatically for 2007.
Fundamentally, they moved it from the open desert to an urban environment. A simulated city, basically.
That must have added layers of complexity.
Massive complexity. Suddenly you have traffic lights, intersections, other moving vehicles, maybe simulated pedestrians, parking, all this stuff that humans navigate, sometimes messily, but we manage.
But for robots,
It's incredibly difficult. The sources really emphasize how hard it is for machines to handle the ambiguities, the unwritten rules, the sometimes irrational behavior of human drivers in a city. Teams were literally studying things like the California Driver Handbook to try and program the rules.
so who did well in that urban setting?
Carnegie Mellon again. Their team, with a Chevy Tahoe named Boss, really excelled. Their approach was focused on breaking down, driving into smaller, manageable tasks, like software modules.
Any interesting details about their process?
The sources have a fun anecdote, apparently. When they fixed a bug in their code, the team would celebrate by playing the Imperial March from Star Wars.
Love it. Geeks rule.
Totally. And they were successful. They navigated the complex urban course and won the 2007 Urban Challenge. Stanford also competed with a Passat wagon called Junior they were testing out on abandoned military bases. But Thrun, their leader, was apparently getting more and more involved with something else.
Which leads us, I'm guessing, to Google.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Larry Page at Google had this vision for autonomous driving. He saw the potential early on. So he hired Sebastian Thrun from Stanford and Chris Urmson from Carnegie Mellon, key figures from the DARPA Challenges, to lead a secret project at Google.
Project Chauffeur.
That's the one. And their initial goals were incredibly ambitious, like driving 100,000 miles autonomously on public roads. They nicknamed that goal Larry 1K. And tackling specific, really challenging routes.
Did they just unleash the cars onto public streets immediately?
No, they started cautiously. Testing first at Moffett Field, that old military base near Google, then careful attempts on public roads, like Central Expressway near their headquarters.
And they learned things quickly, I bet.
They did. One key thing was realizing they needed incredibly detailed maps, like down to the centimeter accurate 3D maps of the roads, which meant they had to build those maps themselves, using their own vehicles equipped with LiDAR scanners.
That sounds like a huge infrastructure challenge in itself.
Absolutely. And then there were all the driving challenges the sources highlight. Dealing with construction zones, which pop up unexpectedly, interacting with human drivers who, don't always follow the rules or give robot cars the space they might need.
Like passing parked cars, maybe.
Exactly. Negotiating narrow streets, handling pedestrians, cyclists, complex intersections. Even things like weather became a factor, although a lot of the early public road testing and later efforts by others gravitated towards places like Arizona, partly for the friendlier weather and regulatory environment.
Did they have any landmark road trips early on?
The sources mention a couple. A successful 100-mile fully autonomous drive down the coast to Cambria. That was a big milestone, apparently celebrated with cheap champagne.
Nice.
But also a really challenging drive into San Francisco, trying to navigate busy Market Street and then the famously twisty Lombard Street. It really highlighted how differently robots and humans perceive driving difficulty. But they did eventually hit that 100,000-mile Larry 1K goal.
Was everything running smoothly inside the Google project, though?
Not entirely, according to the sources. There were internal debates, engineers apparently arguing intensely over seemingly minor details, like the design of buttons inside the car.
Button debates? Really?
Yeah. And there was a growing feeling, among some, that it was turning into this eternal research project without a clear path to becoming an actual product people could use. The sources mentioned Chris Urmson even wrote an internal plea to Google leadership about the project's direction and the need to move faster.
And they had accidents, too.
Well, minor incidents, fender benders, often caused by human drivers hitting them, but the sources mentioned the first serious crash involved one of their test cars, a Prius nicknamed KTT. Yes, like the Knight Rider car.
KTT, okay. What happened?
It was apparently rear-ended pretty hard by a human driver at a yellow light. No serious injuries, but it highlighted the risks of real-world testing.
So Google had this early momentum, pulling in top talent from DARPA. But the race didn't stay confined to them for long.
No, it really opened up, became a much bigger field pretty quickly. Uber jumped in under Travis Kalanick. That was a dramatic entrance.
How so?
They acquired Auto. That was Anthony Lewandowski's self-driving truck company, which he started after leaving Google. The sources describe Kalanick and Lewandowski having these walking meetings near the San Francisco Ferry Building.
And that acquisition was controversial.
Very. Especially because of the legal battles that followed, with Google, now Waymo, suing Uber, alleging Lewandowski stole trade secrets. It got messy.
Okay, so tech companies battling it out. How did the traditional car manufacturers react to all this?
They had to react, yeah. Though maybe a bit cautiously at first. Ford, for example, they'd actually participated in the DARPA challenges way back. But initially, their public focus seemed more on advanced driver assist systems, not full autonomy right away.
So helping the driver, not replacing them entirely yet.
Yeah, right. The sources suggest that under CEO Mark Fields, they did make a bigger push, later gave a big speech at CES, opened a research center in Palo Alto. But they also reportedly struggled with some internal bureaucracy. One source calls it big company disease. It seemed they weren't testing as aggressively on public roads in California as Google or some others were initially.
And their approach was different from, say, Fiat Chrysler.
Yeah, the sources mentioned Fiat Chrysler took a different route, partnering directly with Google early on to provide vehicles, the Pacifica minivans, for their self-driving fleet.
What about General Motors?
GM. GM, under CEO Mary Barra, also made some big moves. Barra was predicting rapid change in the industry. They developed their Super Cruise system.
That's their hands-free highway system.
Exactly. Developed by Jim Nicolau, who was actually a CMU alumnus from the DARPA days. Super Cruise relied heavily on highly detailed maps, similar to Google's approach, but it was limited to specific mapped highways, about 210,000 kilometers worth initially.
So useful, but not full autonomy everywhere.
Right. But GM also made a more significant move towards full autonomy by acquiring Cruise Automation, a startup. And they invested heavily in Lyft. The goal there seemed pretty clear. Build an autonomous ride-hailing service. This apparently reflected an internal debate at GM push driver assist like Super Cruise, or go all in on building full L4, L5 autonomy.
And then there's Tesla. They took a completely different path, didn't they?
Totally different. Elon Musk's approach with autopilot was really distinctive. Releasing it via a software update in 2015 was a big deal. It meant widespread public use almost immediately.
Which led to some controversy.
Yes, people using it in ways maybe it wasn't intended, videos of drivers taking their hands off the wheel for extended periods, even attempts at cross-country records using it. Technologically, Tesla initially focused heavily on cameras and radar, notably not relying on LiDAR like Google Waymo and others did.
Why no LiDAR, initially?
Musk was publicly critical of LiDAR, calling it expensive and unnecessary. They also, the sources point out, didn't rely on those pre-built high-definition maps in the same way Google or GM Super Cruise did. A very different philosophy.
So it wasn't just big tech versus big auto. You mentioned startups getting involved, too.
Oh yeah, a whole ecosystem popped up. The courses mention names like Zoox, Nutonomy, Drive.ai. Neuro is interesting, founded by guys who left Google's Chauffeur project. May Mobility, founded by Allison Malik, who used to be at GM.
And these startups had different angles.
Often, yeah. Specific niches.
Hmm.
Zoox wanted to completely redesign the car from the ground up, specifically for autonomy. No steering wheel needed. Neuro focused on smaller, unmanned delivery robots. May Mobility concentrated on operating short-distance shuttle routes in controlled environments. It became this really complex, multifaceted landscape, a real storm, as that one source title puts it.
And the sources are clear that the challenges went way beyond just the technology, right? It wasn't just about getting the sensors and software to work.
Absolutely not. That was hard enough. But the other hurdles are huge. Safety, obviously, is number one. The sources bring up the sobering statistic of increasing traffic fatalities overall, which really underscores the potential stakes, both good and bad. Every accident involving a test vehicle, or even a car with advanced driver assist, became a major public story. Validating safety is incredibly difficult.
And regulation seems like a constantly moving target.
A huge puzzle. Even just getting permission to test on public roads in different states, Nevada, California, Arizona, were early ones, that was an initial hurdle. Then you get into the nitty-gritty of writing the rules. What data needs to be recorded, like a black box? What are the requirements for safety drivers?
Safety drivers being the humans ready to take over.
Exactly. How should they be trained? There was even debate about things like whether autonomous cars should have a special light. The sources mention a proposed Bruce light to signal to pedestrians and other drivers that the car is in autonomous mode. Google reportedly pushed back against that, fearing it might encourage people to take risks around the car.
That makes sense. And then there's public perception, trust.
It's absolutely critical. You need regulators, insurance companies, lawyers, and just the general public to actually trust this technology.
Yeah.
It's a massive leap of faith. The sources even touch on some slightly weird early publicity tactics.
Like what?
Like one DARPA-era team, Axion Racing, apparently used twin models posing with her autonomous Jeep for a promotional calendar, called it the Spirit of Cosray. It just shows the lengths teams went to get noticed, maybe build some buzz, not always in the most conventional ways.
Okay, wow. And beyond trust, there's the whole question of, does this actually make business sense? Is it profitable?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Mhm.
The sources point out the sheer cost. Building and constantly updating those high-definition maps, if your system relies on them, is incredibly expensive. And then making the technology work reliably, not just in sunny California or Arizona, but everywhere. Different weather, different road conditions, different driving cultures, different local rules. It's immensely complex.
So maybe owning a self-driving car isn't the first step.
That's what a lot of the thinking shifted towards. Maybe the first, most viable business models aren't selling personal autonomous cars, but using the tech in mobility services. Robotaxis like Uber or Lyft want to build. Autonomous delivery vans like Neuro. Or those fixed-route shuttles like May Mobility. Maybe even long-haul trucking like Otto was aiming for.
And woven through all this tech and business strategy are the people, right? The personalities, the conflicts.
Definitely. The sources keep coming back to the dynamics, the internal debates at Google, the controversies surrounding someone like Lewandowski. The sources mention details like him wearing an I drink your milkshake t-shirt at one point.
Referencing the movie There Will Be Blood, the
Yeah.
ruthless oil man.
Exactly. And how he apparently framed his own story in terms of a hero's journey. It adds this layer of human ambition and sometimes friction. Plus, that recurring sci-fi influence keeps popping up.
The Star Trek audiobook, The Imperial March.
Right. And Tether's Heinlein fandom. One source translator even interprets the whole endeavor through this lens of the developers being like modern heroes on a quest, seeking honor and immortality through technological achievement, kind of like figures in ancient epics.
It adds a whole different dimension to just writing code, and it all seems to circle back to that Moravec's paradox you mentioned earlier.
It really does. The sources reiterate how fundamentally difficult it remains to get robots to perform these tasks that seem simple to us perceiving the world, navigating messy reality. It's still harder than mastering complex but closed systems like chess.
A really powerful reminder of just how complex the real world is. So where do the sources leave us? This was mostly chronicled up to around 2021. What was the state of play then?
Well, the race was definitely still on, no question. But maybe some of the really intense, almost feverish hype from the mid-2010s had cooled down a bit. The sources note that the bold declarations about imminent deployment were largely gone.
Reality setting in. Seems like it. Accidents involving autonomous test vehicles or even advanced driver assist systems were still happening. The fundamental challenges, safety validation, regulation, finding profitable business models, gaining that public trust, they were all still very much present and significant.
So the finish line wasn't quite in sight.
Not clearly, no. And while autonomous driving tech had advanced hugely, the sources also note that other forms of future mobility were still being actively explored. Things like Hyperloop, flying cars, even tunnels like the Boring Company stuff. The transformation of transportation is happening, potentially reshaping cities, but the final form and the exact timeline, still very unclear. The technological storm, as the source called it, is still ongoing.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through this technological storm today. We've traced it from those early military seeds and the crucial DARPA challenges, seen the tech giants like Google jump in, watched the traditional automakers like Ford and GM respond, and explored that whole dynamic ecosystem of startups. And highlighted not just the massive technical puzzles, but also those equally important human elements, the regulatory hurdles, the business questions. It's all intertwined.
It really is. The sources show this period as a fascinating intersection of incredible ambition, powerful technology, and some really thorny real-world problems.
It really underscores just how complex it is to try and reshape something as fundamental to our lives as how we get around.
Absolutely. And as this technological storm continues, as we see more of these vehicles, maybe in testing or limited service around us, it leaves us with a really important question to think about, one that touches on that Philippians quote from the start. How do we, as a society, balance this powerful drive for innovation and speed with the absolute necessity of ensuring safety, developing thoughtful regulation, and building genuine public trust in these increasingly capable machines? Something for all of us to consider. Thank you for listening.
See you next time.